Excuse my hair, I know it's a bit of a mess. Had to run it under the old sink to get it to cooperate, even the slightest bit. But everything that I've noticed the past couple days all over my social media feed has been the reaction to the brand new game that has come out, which would be referred to as Suicide Squad Kills or Kill the Justice League. And the most important thing about that game that has been talked about, complained about, and everybody is upset about the death of the Batman in that game. Now, if it was just an alternate reality version of Batman, that wouldn't bother anybody. But I think that there is extra bitterness about it because, one, yes, it is Kevin Conroy's unfortunate, potentially last performance of Batman, and you know there is. He didn't, they didn't know that he was going to pass away when they were making this game. So it's kind of unfair for us to, batter it for that. However, the people who are upset about the death, the unceremonial and undeserved and bad death of a beloved character in service of a not great story have every right to be upset. Which the death of this Batman, which would be the Arkham version Batman, why they made it the Arkham version Batman, I'm not 100% sure, but it was a not deserved, badly written death of a very beloved character to a lot of people's hearts. But I can think of one game that did that even better, that really kickstarted this whole thing, and that would be the game that I have yet to forgive, The Last of Us Part 2. The bitterness in my heart and soul has depleted over the years as that game has come out, and I've gotten over it a little bit as we have moved on with life because it is just a video game. But I can confidently say that The Last of Us Part 2 was not one that I ever revisited. And the only time that I'm going to really revisit it is whenever Season 2 and Season 3 of The Last of Us on HBO comes out, which is starting filming pretty soon, but I'm pretty sure they're operating around Pedro Pascal's schedule, considering that he is the most popular actor on the planet right now. Now, my hope is that they rewrite the story for The Last of Us Season 2 and Season 3 in some capacity. I know that they're not going to be able to stretch out everything in the game over the course of one season. It seems like they're going to take 2 or 3 seasons to get this done, but I hope they change it in some capacity. Now, I am a believer that Joel should die in the season just like he died in the game. It's how it was done and how the story that perceived and was followed was done. And I'm not here to talk about the show, even though I'm not really super excited to watch Pedro Pascal get his head caved in with a golf club. I'm here to talk about the game and how that made me feel and how it made a lot of other people feel and how the perception has shifted slightly over the last couple years. But I think that the bitterness and the feelings of it still exist. The Last of Us Part 2 had an interesting rollout because if you remember about a year previous or 6 months previous to the game's release, we were in the middle of the pandemic when all this was going down, was the massive leaks that came out, leaking that Joel would, of course, die in a golf clubby, 9-irony type of way. Now, I was unfortunately spoiled to these leaks. However, I decided to give the game a chance just because based on how fantastic its predecessor was. Did I say that right? Predecessor? Would it be the predecessor? How great The Last of Us Part 1 was. That was a game that I revisited and replayed. I think I probably beat it 6 times, something like that. Because it was a game that you could really always go back to. There was no struggle going back to that game and replaying it. You can't play it back to back. I didn't do that. I would play it, go play another game, be bored, be like, hey, you know what? Why not just pop in The Last of Us and play this again? And then the cycle will repeat itself. The Last of Us Part 2 did not get that same treatment, but, to each their own. Anyways, I remember exactly where I was when this game came out. I was in my apartment. It was a rainy day. It was in the middle of COVID, and I was home alone. My folks were out traveling somewhere, and I was by my lonesome. And I remember I took off work for this entire weekend so I could play The Last of Us Part 2. Knowing the leaks and the spoilers that came ahead, I was hoping that there would be miscontext to it, and I wanted to give it a chance. I owed Naughty Dog to give it a chance, as they are my favorite game developer, because they've only really made slaps. The Last of Us 1, 2, 3, and 4 were all phenomenal games, and the Uncharted 1, 2, 3, and 4 were all phenomenal games, and The Last of Us Part 1, I mean, come on, it's one of the greatest games, if not the greatest game ever created. And Naughty Dog has not slighted me up to this point, and I wasn't about to turn my back on them despite some leaks. I was going to give them the benefit of the doubt and see what context could be provided to potentially make the situation better, or fix it in some way that makes it not as bad as it was perceived in the leaks. I get the game, I pop it in the old PS4, the PS4 sounds like it's going to fly away like a jet engine, and I play The Last of Us. Now, it is a 27-hour game, and whenever I get a new game, I like to kind of power through it. Now, it's impossible to sit there and play 27 hours worth of video game. You have to take breaks, but I would say I beat it within 2 to 3 days. Probably 3 days. That's probably my guess. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that's probably more accurate. But anyways, the first day I played it, I got to the point where Joel died. And let me tell you, if I can say that the one thing Naughty Dog did that no other game has been able to do was to make me feel emotionally in some type of way. I was unbelievably bitter and angry and frustrated. You can go look at my tweets and understand how upset and I could not believe what I was seeing. And as I said, it was not from the perspective of Joel dying. That is not my concern. After the events of The Last of Us Part 1, Joel dying is the correct choice. But it seemed to me that there was a massive misunderstanding from the creators of the game and Neil Druckmann himself as to what made the first game so unbelievable in the first place. But the thing is, that sentence in itself would be incorrect because he does understand it. He just wanted to destroy it and come at it in a different perspective. The first game was all about love. The second game was all about anger and hate, and he wanted to make you feel those emotions, and then he wanted to try and show you Abby and her character and taking care of her, the kid. I can't remember the kid's name. That was a good character. I can't remember the kid's name. Lev? Was it Lev? In the Lev story was super interesting about him being in the cults but being banished because of his reasons with his gender and his sexuality and a post-apocalyptic story. That's I mean, you don't see that a lot, and I actually kind of liked that aspect of it because they didn't shove it down your throat. The whole leaks were like, oh, they're going to shove this down your throat. They didn't. They did. They actually handled that part very well. If there's anything that I can do to not bash The Last of Us Part 2, the Lev storyline was actually done pretty well. But they killed off Joel in service of a story that nobody really wanted. And the hate that rolled out for this game was astronomical. But I'm sure Naughty Dog already expected that. I'm sure they weren't surprised that they got as much hate as they did for this game. Because over time, just like the stages of grief, a lot of people kind of got into the acceptance phase, and it started to shift a little bit. People are now appreciating the really good parts of the game, which would be the action in the game is phenomenal. The graphics are some of the prettiest graphics I've ever seen in any video game ever. The brutality of it, but that was the point. They wanted to make the game as brutal as humanly possible to make you feel in some type of way, or to give it that realism factor of Ellie is hunting these people down, and these are human lives that are being taken because of what's happened with the death of Joel. In The Last of Us Part 2 it is a natural continuation of The Last of Us Part 1 because it is about the consequences of Joel's actions and how that affects everybody. In theory, that's not a bad idea. A revenge storyline for The Last of Us Part 2 is something that I would have actually gone the route of, and the consequences of Joel's actions was another thing that I would have gone the route of as well. However, it's how Naughty Dog handled that entire experience was that the characters were I mean, Ellie is bitter and hateful, and that is completely acceptable. I saw a lot of people being upset that Ellie was not her same self, but she just really lost her dad and is destroyed by rage and revenge. However, the problems are that Dina is not, the relationship between Dina and Ellie is not super human. It doesn't feel earned. It doesn't feel natural. They didn't stick you in Abby's shoes for 12 hours to make you understand her perspective, but in my opinion, we were so mad over Joel, and nobody really wanted to give it a chance. And it's hard to give me a chance, or it's hard for you to ask me to do that. And by the end of the game, was I wanting Ellie to pull back in any sort of way? No, that was not my perspective. And I saw a lot of people bashing Neil Druckmann, saying, oh, you're just a bad person because you want revenge. I don't know if that was really the route he was going for, but this isn't real life. It's a video game, and it's a storyline being told. This fake character killed another fake character that I liked. Of course, I want her erased or whatever. It doesn't matter in the real life sense of terms. But the problem with the story and why The Last of Us Part 2 did not work, and I understand that he tried to do his own little flip on it, was that The Last of Us Part 1 was so successful because of the relationship between Joel and Ellie. With Joel dying very early on in The Last of Us Part 2, The Last of Us Part 2 was not about the relationship of Joel and Ellie, at least not in the way that we wanted it. Neil Druckmann tried to do a spin on things where The Last of Us Part 2 was really about the relationship between Joel and Ellie, and how Ellie feels once Joel's taken away, and how she becomes a version of Joel, and how Joel is in the flashbacks, and how all of this, every death and every murder and every destruction and every person that falls in Ellie's path is in response to the relationship of Ellie and Joel. However, while that is true and the writing does make sense in that perspective, that's not what we asked for. When creating a sequel to a very, very successful game, you have to tread on very, very, very light ground, and you have to be very careful. Especially because the sequel really didn't need to be made in the first place. And in my opinion, you don't want to be super fan servicey, but every sequel and every game designer, every person who makes art or a movie, and your goal is to make a sequel just based on the success of the first one, I think you have to hold it in your hearts to, in some way, give the fans what they're asking for. Joel dying in this game, if he had to die, I'm 100% on board, and if I was writing The Last of Us Part 2, I would have done that as well. The Last of Us Part 2 being about the consequences of Joel's accident in The Last of Us Part 1, I would have done that as well. Abby being a villain, I would have done that as well, except they didn't make Abby a villain, they kind of switched it, but you could still had the Lev storyline in there if you wanted to, because that would have put a really good double on it at the end. But putting the Lev storyline in order to try and make us feel sympathy for Abby, or to make us understand Abby's perspective in any type of way was not going to work because it felt very forced. But maybe doing a version of that where Abby is strictly the villain of the game. She is a villain, but they still throw in the Lev storyline to subtly kind of show it. That would be fine with me. But the way that I would have done the game is that I would have had it be based off the exact game that you promoted in the trailers, where it's Dina's death that causes Ellie to lose her mind and to go on a path of revenge and tear through Seattle to get to Abby. I would have done a version of the game where Joel, he does not die in the assault on Jackson from Abby's group, and maybe he gets hurt, or he gets affected in some way, but Joel chases after Ellie, but Ellie blames Joel for the death of Dina. and Ellie is on this revenge path tearing through Seattle, and Joel is just following her, trying to make sure she is safe. And at the beginning of the game, they absolutely hate each other because of the situation that happened in The Last of Us Part 1. It is even tacked onto the fact that Ellie now blames Joel for the death of Dina because potentially Abby and her group were there to get Joel but didn't, and Dina ended up paying the consequences of that. And over the course of the game, it's a 27-hour-long game, so you can really play with this. Over the course of the game, while they were very, very far apart, they start growing closer and closer and closer, just as they did in The Last of Us Part 1. However, it's under deeply, deeply different circumstances. And then I would have at the end of the game, Joel potentially dying to Abby in some capacity. And maybe you keep Abby alive going into the third game, because you can also do a third game where Ellie is grieving over Joel, but is being chased down by the Fireflies. And I'm sure that's going to be the plot of the third game in any way. But I would also probably have Ellie, get what she gets and gets rid of Abby at the end as the final boss, and Joel passes away, with knowing that Ellie forgives him and accepts him and is holds no feelings of distraught or meant towards him, because that's all Joel really cared about. He loves his daughter, and he wants to be close to her, and he wants to get it right this time. He wants to protect and he wants to save Ellie, and the destruction and the path and the consequences that followed for his decision in The Last of Us Part 1. I think that it's important for him to understand that he did wrong. And he accepts that in The Last of Us Part 2, but all he wants is for Ellie to forgive him, or he just wants her to be safe. And at the end of the game, she is. However, I would say in the third game, Joel's consequences continue to follow Ellie, where potentially it's her life that gets taken at the end of the game in service of maybe saving the world from the cure. Now, the problem with my little story or synopsis that I just came up with is that you have to really make the relationship between Dina and Ellie believable, which is something they did not do in the original Last of Us Part 2. And if Dina were to die at the beginning or near the beginning of the game, you only have 3 or 4 hours to kind of capitalize on that and try to make the relationship seem as organic as humanly possible. But I'm sure if you cut out some things, you have some time to play with. But The Last of Us Part 2 and the story that we got was something that it's a very unique experience for any video game that I've ever played because of how hateful and how resentful I became whenever I was playing it. Neil Druckmann certainly succeeded at bringing those emotions out of me, and that's something that I could totally appreciate. However, it's the story of the game that to this day I have not forgiven, mainly because of the potential of what could have been. And going into The Last of Us Season 2 and Season 3, I'm unbelievably nervous because once again with The Last of Us Part 1 or The Last of Us Season 1 on HBO, he did a fantastic job, or they did a fantastic job. I didn't think it was done as well as in the games, but I thought it was, in TV version, it was really good. And I'm afraid they're going to do the exact same thing in the show. And literally just make it beat for beat, and Pedro gets his head smacked in. And at that point, I can't promise that I'm going to stick around for that. Yeah, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that I've not yet forgiven, but I've come to accept as the stages of grief have taken over, and acceptance is the last stage. I've come to accept The Last of Us Part 2, but I've not forgiven it. And I hope that over the course of Season 2 and Season 3 of the HBO version, they do better, and they learn from their mistakes, and they come up with something different. That is my only hope. I don't have any promise or any security that that's going to happen, but I can only hope. Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed this little rant. The next episode will be about Cars 3 probably, because I just watched that and I thought it was pretty good. But anyways, peace, love, adios, bye-bye.